This great land will always be one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. So tonight we have Josh Alliance to give us sort of a history of this concept of separation of church and state that has become so popular in the last, 70 or so-ish years. And he'll give us a rundown sort of how it began and sort of tumbled in its rightness and then how it turned into where it is today. So then we'll just have, I guess, it'll just sort of be an open discussion.
Absolutely. Open discussion is a great way to go through this topic. I think last year we had some people writing down notes during the conversation, and all of this information is over at ForgottenMen.com. It's actually the top link, ForgottenMen.com. It's the top link. It's a blog post called Separation of Church and State, and all the sources, all the material that we're going to be talking about can all be found right there on the page. And there's also already a video from about the first half of last year's talk, along with, right under that, 2 links to a radio show that we did that following Saturday that kind of reiterated all of the whole entire discussion for both hours on the topic. So there's plenty of information to kind of go back to if you're missing something or you want to find out more or kind of delve into the sources, source documents. It's all there at ForgottenMen.com. Again, my name is Joshua Williams. I am a parishioner here. Have been for about 8 years now. And this is a topic that actually really springboarded my passion into the political and economic foray about a decade, 12 years ago, somewhere around there. And it really was born out of I was going to be getting married, and so I kind of got that that question of, all right, what is truth? I'm going to have kids. I need to know what to impart to those kids. So I went on. I reinvigorated my journey of faith. And I came back to the Catholic Church after years of being away, since being a teenager. And on that journey, I kind of stumbled into this thing called separation of church and state. And the more I started learning about it, the more I started getting very frustrated, because what I was told and taught and talked about with people was entirely historically inaccurate. And we're going to kind of go through a little bit of that tonight. Without getting too far into the discussion, the concept of separation of church and state really is actually more about our understanding of the makeup of our government. And when I say our government, I'm not just talking, it's not one blob of a government. There are many governments that we have here, and we'll talk about federalism and how that kind of plays into it. So just kind of starting out here with the actual verbiage, separation of church and state. Who can tell me where that's from? And if you were here last year, Dan, keep your hand down. Dan, keep your hand down. Where does that concept come from? Is it the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution? Somebody last year raised the point about the Federalist Papers. Does anybody know where that phrase actually comes from?
I have a note from my notes that I took last year that came from Thomas Jefferson's letter response to Roger Williams, assuring that the government would not infiltrate religion.
That is absolutely correct. So most people that you ask will say, oh, it's in the Constitution. Yeah. There are no words in the United States Constitution that says it. One of the responses that I got last year was, it's the First Amendment. Well, if you actually break apart the First Amendment, it says nothing about separation of church and state. It talks about religious freedom, if you will. And we'll talk about that as we go. So it was a response letter to the Danbury Baptist Association back in 1802. Roger Williams was the pastor of the Danbury Baptist Association, and he had penned a letter to President Jefferson. And it was because of their concern or rumor that a particular denomination would soon be recognized as like the national denomination. And if you recall, our first colonies and then states were very diverse they had different kind of state denominations. They had a lot of different denominations throughout the states. And they were very concerned about one denomination kind of becoming similar to the church in England, where it dominated everything, and then it would not allow for religious freedom throughout the colonies and then the states. So this letter was penned to Jefferson, and I'll read some words of that letter. Roger Williams stated, "I contemplate with solemn reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." We recognize that. We're talking about the First Amendment. "Thus building a wall of separation between church and state." And that was the response back from Jefferson to Roger Williams, because Roger Williams wrote, "When they have opened a gap in the hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, God hath ever broken down the wall itself, and that therefore, if he will please to restore his garden in paradise again, it must of necessity be walled in peculiarly unto himself from the world." So what Roger Williams is really saying is he wants to go ahead and separate the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world. It wasn't necessarily the world from the garden of the church. So putting it into that context, you can see why Jefferson had penned his letter basically using that phrase, thus building a wall of separation between church and state, because it was going back to the free exercise. It had nothing to do with removing faith from the political realm, from what's going on, what the legislature is doing. And that was the genesis of this phrase, separation of church and state. So that phrase actually really didn't catch anybody's ire until much later. Nobody talked about it out of that letter. It was kind of dug up in the 1900s, way later on. So kind of, we're going to talk a lot about the structure of government in our governments, because that's really, through that lens, we can understand why separation of church and state has become so convoluted in today's society. And we have certain things like, Sally Smith can't get up at a graduation ceremony and thank her Lord and Savior. That's what we have today. So what I would offer is that the biggest misunderstanding of the concept of separation of church and state is really a misunderstanding of really three things. One being federalism, concept of federalism. Two being the purpose and construction of the United States Constitution. And then three, the application of the original amendments, the first 10 amendments. So one being federalism, two being the purpose and construction of the Constitution, and three being the application of the first amendments to the United States Constitution. So can anybody tell me what federalism is? Anybody have an idea? Can you explain the concept? We hear the word, but I think it's not really talked about too much. So here in the United States, we have multiple governments, right? We have a federal government, we have state governments, county governments, municipalities. What federalism is really boils down to multiple governments having jurisdiction over the same people. And those governments are delegated certain authorities, certain powers. So here in Maryland, we are both Marylanders and we're where we live in the United States. So the federal government has jurisdiction over us in certain areas, and the Maryland state government has jurisdiction in certain areas. But we, the people, have delegated that authority to those governments. So Federalist 45 was penned by Madison, and it really, Anybody not familiar with the Federalist Papers and even the Anti-Federalist Papers? Just kind of, those were the papers that were written when the Constitution was being proposed, if you will. They were the documents that Madison, Jay, a couple others, along with Anti-Federalists like Mason, and there was a bunch of people in the founding era. The Federalists were the people who wanted to ratify the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists were the people who didn't necessarily want to ratify the Constitution, or at least not as it was written without other restrictive language or changes. So when Madison was trying to sell the Constitution, one of the Federalist Papers that he wrote was Federalist 45. And the key statement in Federalist 45 is the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. Does that sound anything like the type of government that we have today? I mean, it doesn't. I cannot hold that statement up to what the federal government and most politicians, doesn't matter what level of government they're at, actually try to convey about the United States Constitution. It doesn't resemble it at all. What that's saying is the federal government has a little bit of power, the state governments have a whole lot of power. And now we know that is completely untapped. The federal government basically rules over 300 and some odd million people. And then it's kind of like the state governments are administrative arms of the federal government, and they have to do the bidding of the federal government. And there's some reasons why that is the case, but that is certainly not what was ratified when the Constitution, or agreed to when the Constitution was ratified. So we've all heard the term separation of powers. So, and a lot of times we think of that just at the federal government level, where you have your different branches of federal government. So you have your executive, your legislative branch, your judicial branch. But those aren't the only separation. Also, those are kind of the horizontal separation of powers. There's also vertical, where you have different levels of government. And really, you have we the people, all the citizens. You have municipalities, you have state governments, and you have federal governments. And in the United States Constitution, it did something very different than what many nations around the world had done. It was actually delegating power from the people, not necessarily kind of the other way around, where like a central government or a king or something was saying, okay, this is what my authority is, I'll let you guys do X, Y, and Z as the people. Who can tell me what the purpose of the United States Constitution is? What's the purpose of that?
The government.
To run the government. What government?
Government of the United States.
Okay, so federal government.
Yeah,
So federal government. Okay. Okay.
What the exact was the form of more perfect union?
That's part of the preamble. Absolutely. So
And the rights of the federal government.
that's right about there. That's right about there, and to your points as well. It really, it's to document the agreed upon powers that the federal government has been delegated. When I say delegated, it means, not granted. The granted actually means given. Delegated is, this is on loan. I can take it back at any time if I want to, through the proper course of action. So the purpose of the United States Federal Constitution is we're going to document what the authority of the federal government is, and also its limitations. So, to your point. There are certain areas in the United States Constitution that do talk about limitations on the states. Generally, that's in, I think it's Article 1, Section 10. But that's very small. But that document was really to limit the power of the United States federal government. And that's incredibly important when we kind of get into the next topic of who the Bill of Rights applies to. So we have our federal constitution, but we all have state constitutions as well. Every state in the Union has a state constitution. And what that does is it delegates the authority to the people of that state, from the people of the state to that state government. And it says what power that state government has. In just about every state government, there's also a Bill of Rights, or Declaration of Rights. You know that? A lot of people don't even know that, like, the Maryland Constitution in and of itself has a Declaration of Rights, which is the same thing as a Bill of Rights. And that's actually the whole entire purpose of those Bill of Rights for the state, at the state level, or Declaration of Rights at the state level, is to protect the citizens and limit that state government in what it has the authority to do or not do. So, kind of gave you the answer. But the Federal Bill of Rights, the U.S. Bill of Rights, and by the way, the first 10 amendments actually weren't called the Bill of Rights until much later. Who does the Bill of Rights apply to? Anybody tell me that?
The federal government?
The federal government. Anybody else?
The people?
People. Any other thoughts? By the way, you can answer sometimes, Dan.
Well, yeah, it seems like it's the rights of the people and the restrictions on the government and the powers that have been delegated to them.
Absolutely. So, to your point, it protects the people, but it restricts the federal government. As they were ratified, the United States Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, were written to further restrict the federal government. Is that the case today? Today, how it's being used is that the first 10 amendments, really the first 8, those first amendments are also restrictive of the state governments, right? I mean, if you think back to a lot of court cases that you hear, the state governments are actually restricted by, well, this is infringing upon my First Amendment right. Or my Second Amendment rights that I have from guns, for example. But what we have been trained to understand, and it's because of some court cases that happen, we'll talk about those. What's happened is that we look at it as the government can't do this. Where what's happening is we're taking powers from the state government and we're making it so the federal government has authority over those state governments, even though the federal government was never given the authority to stop the state governments. This will come into context as we talk about some cases that involve religious freedom, for example. So I want to read just a small part of the preamble to the U.S. Bill of Rights. Anybody know there was a preamble to the Bill of Rights? Right? Most people don't even know that because you just see them as amendments to the Constitution. So the preamble, here's a piece in it. The conventions of a number of the states, having at the time of their adopting the Constitution, expressed a desire in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added, and as extending the ground of public confidence in the government will best ensure the beneficent ends of its institution. So right in the preamble, it's saying the states who ratified the Constitution on behalf of the people of those states, they're saying, essentially, these further restrictive clauses on the general government, that's what it used to be called, the central government, federal government, must be placed on that government. Not on the states. The states were the ones that ratified it.
It's amazing that the word restrictions is in there.
Right in there.
Clear.
I mean, it's literally, I mean, if you read the documentation, it's incredibly clear on what they were trying to do. So that Bill of Rights absolutely documented specifically what the federal government was being stopped from doing. namely related to guns, related to illegal searches and seizures, related to stopping or curtailing some sort of free exercise of religion or establishing a religion. It was completely stopped from doing that. Right there, ratified. It's also to point out that, important to point out that many people look at the "we the people" language in the Constitution as the people ratified the Constitution, but actually the people of the states, on behalf of the states, ratified the Constitution. It wasn't like a populace type of a thing. There were votes in each state convention, and the states actually ratified the United States Constitution. And it even says that in the Constitution, where it says ratified by the states. So let's go ahead and kind of go into a recap here. Federalism, we have a breakdown of powers within the government. People have delegated many powers to the state governments, and they're to remain numerous and indefinite, just like Madison said in Federalist 45. In the federal government, very few and defined powers. Federalism being the jurisdiction, the government having, multiple governments having jurisdiction over their inhabitants. Next, the purpose and construction of the Constitution. It's there to document what authority the federal government has. And then finally, the Bill of Rights applies, what we think of as the U.S. Constitution's Bill of Rights applies specifically and was ratified to limit the federal government, not the state governments. So there was a court case back in 1833, Barron versus Baltimore. I say 1833. It was one of the first cases that actually discussed the application of the Bill of Rights. The Chief Justice at the time, John Marshall, I kind of think of him as Hamilton of his day. He was a big nationalist. He liked a one-size-fits-all type government. He wanted an all-powerful central government, if you will. And he wrote for a unanimous court decision, and he said specifically that the first 10 amendments contain no expression indicating an intention to apply them to state governments. This court case comes right from the Supreme Court, Chief Justice on a unanimous decision. So that kind of leads us to believe, okay, we're on the right track, right? Because at least in 1833,
So far, so good.
So far, so good. But it's important to note that states can be tyrannical just like a federal government can be. The benefit there, in that instance, with federalism, having different states, different state governments, if my state government is incredibly tyrannical, I have the ability to move, to transport somewhere else. I can go to another state that fits my type of governance or isn't as corrupt as where I am today. I can go somewhere else. The danger of the central government being tyrannical is, where are you going to go? If you're an American, where are you going to go? And that is the importance also of the states having their own state constitutions and their state bills of rights and declarations of rights. That limits their state constitutions, their state governments from doing something tyrannical to them. So let's kind of look back to some of the state constitutions back when, back around the time of ratification, because I think that's going to really further put into context of where this concept may be right or may be wrong related to separation of church and state. And if we believe everything we're being told today, those guys back in 1776 and around that era, they're of course, they're going to say you can't have any faith in your government, right? And that's what we're led to believe. So let's go ahead and look at the Virginia Constitution that was ratified in 1776. Section 16, it starts out, that religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. And therefore all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience. And it is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. Wait a minute. Everyone would have us believe today that the United States Constitution said you can't have faith in government, right? I'm reading right out of the document that was ratified in 1776 by many of the same people who were involved in crafting the Constitution and crafting the Bill of Rights.
If I can interrupt for a second. Sure. Part of my speech that I forewent at the beginning is a quote from Washington. And you guys who are here Monday, this will be the second time I've heard it. But he says, "Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." So,
What was the source of that, Ben?
I think that's his farewell speech.
I don't know which.
Washington. Oh,
I understand it was Washington, but his writings and sayings are multiple volume set. I'm trying to.
But I think that was his farewell speech when he left office. Yeah. Absolutely. So there are countless quotes from the founding generation that are very, very similar to that. But it's in the context of what we're talking about tonight where it really does come to play, of where there may be a separation or not maybe a separation. So here in America, we're always told that we separate religion from faith, separate religion and faith from law. And that's what we are told. And we just looked at the Virginia Constitution from way back when, and it didn't quite seem that way. So what do we normally point to, or what do the courts normally point to, or what does the ACLU normally point to when they say, right there in the Constitution it says there's a separation of church and state? What is that clause? What's that section?
I can't remember the citation, but it's where the government shall establish no religion.
Bingo. First Amendment. Exactly. You got it right. So it states, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And it goes on to other things like freedom of speech and press and right to peacefully assemble, petition your government for redress of grievances. But it's usually that first clause and a half there about making no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So it's really, that First Amendment is 6 limitations on the federal government. 1, Congress shall make no law establishing religion. 2, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion, meaning worship. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, abridging really to cut short, to stop speech. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. Congress shall make no infringing upon the right to peaceably assemble. And Congress shall make no law infringing upon the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. So let's... Congress, right? Who's Congress? The United States Federal Congress. They cannot make a law establishing religion.
Does that include not making a law that you can't pray against the government?
No.
You can't make a law.
If anything, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion.
That includes government.
Congress shall make no law. Does that say at any point any other department of the government can't do these things either? The First Amendment actually specifically is talking about making a law. Where a law is made? Congress. That's the actual limitation of the First Amendment. So, if they really truly did mean that we're supposed to separate faith from politics, from government, then, Virginia must have been out on their own on that. They must have been, off their rocker. Let's go to another constitution. Let's go to Delaware's constitution, also 1776. In Article 22, it says, every person who shall be chosen a member of either house or appointed to any office or place of trust before taking a seat or entering upon the execution of his office shall take the following oath or affirmation, if conscientiously scrupulous of taking an oath. So far, so good. No mention of faith, religion, etc. It goes on to say, I, and basically insert your name, will bear true allegiance to the Delaware state, submit to its constitution and laws, all right, and do no act wittingly whereby the freedom thereof may be prejudiced. So far, so good. They weren't those crazy religious types, apparently, in Delaware. It says, and also make and subscribe the following declaration, to wit, we're doing good here. I, insert your name, do profess faith in God the Father and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, and in the Holy Ghost, one God, blessed forevermore, and I do acknowledge the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. Wait a minute here. Delaware guys are off the rocker just like Virginia people.
So that was the whole office in Delaware.
Yes. Absolutely. It says, and all officers shall also take an oath of office.
And that still stands
Is that
today.
still in the Delaware?
Bear with me. Constitution of North Carolina. It's a nice agricultural-based state. Down home people, good, you know, they don't have it. Virginia, Delaware, they don't know what they're talking about. All right, Constitution of North Carolina, also ratified in 1776. They have to have it right. That no person who shall deny the being of God, okay, here we go, or the truth of the Protestant religion, or the divine authority either of the Old or New Testament, or who shall hold religious principles incompatible with the freedom and safety of the state, shall be capable of holding any office or place of trust or profit in the civil department within this state. So apparently, down in North Carolina, their crops were cash crops, wacky tobacco, because they were smoking it. They obviously were just like Delaware and Virginia. Let's go on. Let's go to Massachusetts, 1780. Oaths and subscriptions, similar to where Delaware talks about this. In Article 1, it says, any person chosen governor, lieutenant governor, counselor, senator, or representative, in accepting the trust, shall, before he proceed to execute the duties of his place or office, make and subscribe the following declaration. It sounds like they're about to go off the tracks here. I do declare that I believe the Christian religion and have a firm persuasion of its truth, and that I am seized and possessed in my own right of the property required by the Constitution as one qualification for the office or place to which I am elected. By the way, the governor had to profess that he was a Christian as well. So how can this even jive with what we are force-fed today? Anybody have any ideas?
Bad case law.
Inca. So let's just revisit again Barron versus Baltimore, where that was the first court case. Yeah, bad case law. The first court case that really discussed the application of the Bill of Rights, Barron versus Baltimore. It specifically said, and the Chief Justice Marshall at the time, I mean, this guy was a nationalist. I mean, he was very much in the camp of Hamilton and his ilk. He said, Bill of Rights, Federal Bill of Rights applies to the federal government. Does not have any expression that it applies to the state governments whatsoever. That was never the case. So this all changed really starting in 1925. There was a court case called Gitlow versus New York. And Gitlow versus New York was a case that first really delved into what is known today as the incorporation doctrine. Anybody ever heard of the incorporation doctrine, or have an idea of what it is, what it might be?
Only from this time last year.
And also on our show, we've done full shows on the incorporation doctrine. In the notes that I pointed to, the ForgottenMen.com webpage, there's links to 2 hours of us talking, going through the incorporation doctrine. But just to kind of hit it at a very high level, what it did was it took the parts of the Due Process Clause in the 14th Amendment that was ratified shortly after the war between the states. It changed the meaning of the 14th Amendment and those on the court said in Gitlow versus New York was that the Bill of Rights, because of certain clauses in the Due Process Clause, certain parts of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, it incorporated the state governments within the limitations of the Bill of Rights, which fundamentally changed our entire government structure. I can't impress upon anybody the significance of what the Supreme Court did about 60 years after the 14th Amendment was ratified. There's a debate on whether or not it was properly ratified, but for all intents and purposes, it's a ratified amendment. So what that did is, 60 years essentially after that amendment was ratified, the Supreme Court changed by legislating from the bench, if you will, the purpose of the Due Process Clause in the 14th Amendment. And now what we have is, now state governments are rolled up underneath the limitations of the Bill of Rights. Think about those constitutions that we just read. Think about all the things that people were able to do under the truly ratified purposes or regulations, rules of the United States Constitution prior to that. This case, Gitlow versus New York, was the first of the Supreme Court cases and other court cases that really started citing application of the Bill of Rights and changing how they apply. So, what does that mean to us? It completely changed how people interacted with their government. And now, when we hear you violated my constitutional rights, that doesn't just apply to the federal government anymore. That really applies to the state governments. And that completely throws off how the balance of powers are supposed to be. So now, where the people never delegated, the people of the states never delegated this vast amount of power to the federal government, the Supreme Court, essentially by decree, they've now changed it so that the federal government now has an infinite number of powers, and the state governments really have few and far. The federal government is numerous and indefinite. It's like Federalist 45 has now been completely flip-flopped. And what that's done is it's made it so the people of the states and state governments now have to fit the Supreme Court's definition of what is constitutional, what is not constitutional, where the federal government was never delegated that authority. The first court case that we see that really incorporated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, we were talking about before, into the 14th Amendment using the Privileges and Immunities Clause. But it applied to state law for the first time. It was a court case called Emerson versus Board of Education in 47, back in 1947. It was brought by a New Jersey taxpayer, and it was all about, he was against tax-funded school district that provided reimbursement to parents of both public and private school children taking the public transportation system to school. And that's where we first see this change, this wholesale change in now the Michael Newdows of the world can go fight against any kind of faith being supported in some way by our government.
What was the name of that again? That case?
Everson versus Board of Education in 1947.
This is a Supreme Court case?
Yes. And all of these cases are detailed in that post that I mentioned on ForgottenMen.com, right at the top of the page.
Quick question, wasn't there another one about that, I don't know, about 55, 58, I remember
when I was in Catholic school, we had that.
I'm actually going to go through a few of them. 55. I'm sure there was one in 55. There's a ton of them. I actually have a list here that I was going to go through. Another one shortly after that was McCollum versus Board of Education in 48. It restricted voluntary religious classes in public school. Voluntary classes. And you'll start seeing the camel's nose under the tent right at this time. And then the camel just barrels through the door over the course of the following 50 years. I've got...
Question for you. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around the consequences of Gitler versus New York. So originally it was the people of each state wrote a constitution to give some powers to their state and everything else, to restrain it otherwise. And then the representatives from the states wrote a constitution that gave some powers to the federal government but restrained it otherwise.
The convention in Philadelphia essentially drafted the Constitution, and then it went out to the state conventions, and the states had conventions, and they either ratified it or they had more conversations and dialogue. In the case of Rhode Island and up there in New England, they didn't ratify it until years later. They were the last state to actually ratify the original 13.
89.
Horrible with numbers with dates, but I think it was right around. It was late. It was very, very late, and it was really because of pressure from the other states. They started really putting the screws to them, basically saying you're going to do this, or we're going to throw a bunch of tariffs and make your life miserable, and they pretty much caved.
So through that process, then people directly or to some degree indirectly defined what was going to happen at the federal level, and everything. They defined what happened at the federal level, and everything undefined would not happen there. And they had...
And the end cap on that was the 10th Amendment. It basically said if it wasn't delegated to the federal government, it's expressly reserved by the states or people.
Okay. So then, and there was a similar thing that existed before that at the state level, where the people were protected from the government getting out of bounds, essentially, by their own state level constitution. So then, this Gitler versus New York, the consequence of it was, correct me if I'm wrong, that's where I'm going here, everything that previously applied only to the federal level now applied also to each state.
Essentially out of the First Amendment. The restrictions of the First Amendment apply through the due process clause.
So now it's, instead of Congress shall make the law, it's no level of government shall make.
It's pretty much what it has come to. Exactly. So that's exactly what. So the incorporation doctrine is where selected provisions of the first 10 amendments are made applicable to the states through the due process clause.
So the variety of governments we would have available to us in each of the 50 states is now much more restricted.
Absolutely. And this is why what Dan said, through bad case law. So really pretty much every decision that we see from the courts, it's all case law. All schools are teaching case law. There's like usually one class on the Constitution, and it's pretty much a joke. It's all what case set what precedent. And it's precedent that essentially rules the court system at this point.
Concrete is that? Is there some foundational law in the country that says follow precedent, or is that just like a convention that the justice system has followed?
Not being a lawyer, I'm not going to be able to give you a perfect answer to that question. What I can say is that judges tend to not want to deviate from precedent. It's very, very rare that you'll see a judge deviate from precedent. A lot of times, if that happens, it's judicial activism, or it's a very, very swollen cultural situation. It's kind of bubbled up, and society is changing, so the term living, breathing constitution kind of rears its ugly head, and the courts deviate from what was actually ratified, or what law actually was to mean at the time that law was written. And that's actually how law is supposed to work. When a law is passed, it's supposed to reflect on who passed the law, why they passed the law, and that's how you interpret the law. It's not through the then cultural lens of how it should be interpreted. And that's where we get the living, breathing Constitution argument, progressing from what a law was to what the judiciary or society.
But what
deems it.
nonsense.
Sure.
That
It's like,
concept is-
I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of like me saying, hey, how about everybody come over to my house, we're going to play poker, and by the way, I get to make up the rules on the fly, and, are you in? Okay, it's $20 buy-in. Your $20, well, actually, my buy-in is $0. And
First rule.
my 2 deuces beats your 2 aces. I'm sorry, you didn't know that? Sorry, okay, hey, I win. That's pretty much just the same concept.
Yeah, they're certainly deviating from the original source document. Right?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, from the preamble, first off, from the preamble of the Bill of Rights, it's very clear. If you go back to Barron versus Baltimore, which relied on that stuff, it says the application was not to the Bill of Rights. As the 14th Amendment goes, there was something there was an amendment called the Blaine Amendment that came shortly after the 14th Amendment was ratified. And then the Blaine Amendment, it attempted to apply the First Amendment to the states. Think about that. An amendment was being offered up to be passed after the 14th Amendment was ratified, quote unquote ratified. That would have put the states underneath the First Amendment, essentially. So now 60 years later, Gittler versus New York starting then, they basically said, through the Due Process Clause, the states were now subject to the restrictions of the Bill of Rights. Well, why would a year from the 14th Amendment, why a year later would Congress be offering up an amendment and voting on an amendment that does just that, specifically the First Amendment?
Was that the addition you're speaking of? Was that voted down?
It ended up being scuttled.
Yeah.
But why would it be being brought up? But on top of that, it was scuttled.
Yeah.
They said that they didn't want that. So it's kind of, there's, like I said, on the post on ForgottenMen.com that goes into this, we'd spent a couple hours on the incorporation doctrine. There's some links to the radio show for that. There's also, right in that same section, there's a link to a lecture given by Professor Tom Woods on the 14th Amendment and the incorporation doctrine. It's a phenomenal lecture. It's a little over an hour, so you might want to break it up into chunks, but I mean, it goes into the specifics that will really capture what we're talking about here today. So like I said, the 14th Amendment and how it was interpreted 60 years later was just wholesale change about how our government operated and how we interact with our state governments and our federal governments. But just kind of going back into some more of those cases, this is kind of really where this whole separation of church and state really bears out. You've got Engel versus Vitale in 62, and another one, Abington versus Schempp in 63, Commissioner of Ed versus School Committee of Layton in 71. This is where they were getting into a verbal prayer offered in school is unconstitutional, even if it's both voluntary and denominationally neutral. Does that even sound like Congress shall make no law establishing religion? Of course it doesn't. So not even the states weren't really restricted to this, but even from the verbiage of what was ratified in that First Amendment, that is not, if you're going to the 6 things that the First Amendment says, that's not Congress shall make no law establishing a religion. Does not fall under Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Another one, Stein versus Ashinsky, 65. There's another one as well. Freedom of speech and press is guaranteed to students unless the topic is religious, at which time such speech becomes unconstitutional. How does that even make sense?
That sounds like they're trying to interpret a law that Congress passed that said, you you shall not talk about religion. And then they're saying they're like upholding that somehow.
If you really look at this, it's the inverse of what the framers were trying to codify in law. It's the exact inverse.
Yet my daughter goes to school, she comes home and she's being taught about the Muslim gods.
Absolutely.
I'm like, I told her, I said, you know, take everything you can and turn it around and learn everything about it. And, you know, it actually brings you closer to God. Because you realize how much BS that.
Sure.
You know,
Sure.
learn everything about it. Read the books that they tell you not to read. Yeah.
What is being taught to kids and to adults alike really is misrepresentation of what is historically accurate. It's complete misrepresentation. And, you know, without going into all of these, I mean, there's another one that Lowe versus City of Eugene. It's unconstitutional for a war memorial to be erected in the shape of a cross. Like, how in the world do you even get that out of the first place?
Where you have all this case law about these decisions that basically are distorted the Constitution. Where are the challenges to that? Are there any?
There have been in more of these. I mean, these are all building ever since in 25, back with Gitwood Lowe versus New York, when it started to incorporate the states underneath the First Amendments. Each one really was a challenge, a negative challenge, but there were those who, you know, were the other side of that and were arguing the other side of it. But there isn't necessarily, what's the best way to say this? To what Dan said earlier, we are ruled by case law now. So precedent has been set. And what's happening is those who want faith out of the public square will continue to press the envelope and build on this bad precedent that we have. And the reason why it started out with those three things, and federalism being one, the only true way I would offer, and this is what we talk about on the radio program every week, the only true way to right the ship is not trying to fight at a federal level. That ship has sailed. Washington, D.C. will never fix Washington, D.C. The only opportunity that we really have is fixing things at the state level and asserting the authority that the people of the states have.